Good evening. Thank you all so much for being here, and especially on such a miserable November night. Special points to you all for coming. My name is Kate Day. I'm Politico Europe's Deputy Editor-in-Chief. I have a few hats, but one of them is running our team here in the UK. We've had a very exciting year. We've started doing coverage of energy and climate, one of the most exciting things we've done this year. We've really expanded quite significantly. Back in December last year, we had 18 reporters in London. Our 40th just arrived in the form of Nicholas Earle, who is our latest climate and energy reporter, and we now have teams covering tech and trade and all sorts of things. So I'm sure you've seen lots more from us. I won't give you the full marketing spiel, but I did want to say to this room how important the coverage of energy and climate is to Politico, not just in London, but to us in DC, where we were founded, and also in Brussels, and increasingly in places like Paris and Berlin and Sacramento and Toronto and all sorts of other places. So it's really a big priority for us going into next year, and we're particularly pleased to be here tonight and having this conversation in person. Lots to get stuck into, and up first, I'm delighted to welcome to the stage the CEO of Virgin Atlantic, Shai Weiss. Thank you so much. Very good to have you here.
Yeah, you sound like an advertisement for an airline with all the offices you have. Oh. Thank you very much. Yeah, please keep it coming.
That's our vibe. I'm in full salesperson mode as we grow, and it's very exciting. It's a very nice position to be in, particularly for a journalist. I feel like it's unusual to be talking about getting bigger, so I'm going to revel in it and not apologize for it. But tell us about you and about your flight, because you've got an exciting week.
Well, actually, an exciting day. So about me is not important. Really, what's happening tomorrow is the most important thing. Tomorrow at 11 o'clock or so, we're going to launch FlyF 100, which is basically the first time a commercial airline is flying on 100% sustainable aviation fuel, which is to say that if you think about decarbonizing aviation, you've really got to prove that the fuel that powers these very large planes can be made more sustainably, and that is what we're going to show tomorrow. It's taken us a year in the making, radical collaboration amongst many participants, including Rolls-Royce and Boeing and others, and it's really a first of its kind proof of concept. The tagline will be, if you'll make it, we'll fly it.
Very good. And I wanted to pick up something you said there about more sustainable, I guess probe this question. Yes. How sustainable is it really? Because if I was feeling skeptical, I might say, well, this sounds like a very good way to keep airlines in business, to keep us all flying. Is this really part of a future? Isn't the future for us all just to fly a bit less?
Well, first, just the answer to the question is it's 70% more efficient or less carbon produced versus fossil-derived jet fuel. So it's like for like when it's on the plane, it feels, it smells, it looks like jet fuel, as you would hope, because it's going to be a safe flight. And I can tell you for sure it's a safe flight. I'll be on it alongside Richard Branson and many others. So that's the first answer. It's a watershed moment. You know, no one has done this before, and the point is that it happens to be that jet fuel is very efficient in storing energy. And so the opportunities for aviation to decarbonize really rest on two angles. One is have the youngest fleet in the sky. I would say, of course, Virgin Atlantic does have the youngest fleet in the sky. We put billions and billions of dollars to work. And the second thing is, for long-haul aviation, I don't think there is an innovation over the next 20, 30, potentially 40 years that will replace jet fuel as the source of energy. So if you want to make aviation less harming to the environment, you have to find a renewable source for fuel. And we totally expected that. You know, people say, is this greenwashing? Are you trying to get us to fly more? Is this a way of letting our conscience feel better about flying? The point is not that. I can tell you that flying is a big part of life as we know it. business, connectivity between families, exploring the world, science, and especially in an island nation, rely on aviation. The only way to do that, and if you want to take it seriously, is to find an alternative source for fuel. And that's what we're showing, that it's safe to do this, that we've proven that it can be done at scale. And then we'll talk probably about the fact that there is not enough of this fuel. So the point is not can it be flown, is how quickly can it be made.
Yeah, I will certainly come to that, and I'm very keen to get into that. I guess I would still, though, question whether have we not seen in the past few years that through the pandemic, where we were all forced to stay at home and not fly across the planet, we could actually function quite well for a lot of trips, and particularly business travel. Lots of people switched to doing things remotely. Is that not part of the answer, that we all just accept we have to fly a little bit less?
So I'm a great believer in progress. Virgin Atlantic has been leading the way for many, many years in sustainability. We've been the leaders for the past 15 years. The first biofuels flight was in 2008. So first of all, I don't believe in going backwards. I believe in going forwards. Will the behaviors of people change in terms of how they work using Teams or Zoom? Of course. Should they fly between Paris and London? Maybe they can take the train. We're not arguing the point. But aviation, travel are here to stay, whether it is for leisure, whether it is for business. And look at this point, here we are. And this event is a live event. It doesn't have the same feeling as if you and I were sitting in different locations around the world. So I'm not arguing the fact that corporations should be more efficient. To the contrary, let them be efficient. But when they fly, they should choose the most efficient form or the least harmful to the environment.
So to your point about making this kind of fuel available, and I know you think there's a role for government. Yes, I believe you think there's a role for government in doing that. I hope we're going to hear a little bit in the next panel how close that might be or not, how realistic that is. My question for you was really, why should government help solve this problem? And particularly in a time where government attention is very scarce, government funds are pretty scarce, why should we as taxpayers and as a population put government effort into trying to fix this problem? Isn't this a problem for you guys?
So let me just frame my answer. I want to frame the problem. So today in the world, 0.1% of the fuel available is made in a renewable fashion. If we're to get to 10% by 2030, we need a scale up of 100 to 150 times the capacity we have today. So we need radical collaboration, of course, but we need a lot of plants and new technologies to emerge to produce this fuel. And why 10%? By the way, 10% is not 100%, but it's a point in time where you think, if we've got to 10%, surely we have the means, the technology, and the willpower to do so. I would say this is, so first of all, it's a problem for the world. It's not just for the UK or Virgin Atlantic. And I would say that the role of government is always there, alongside industry, alongside innovation, to catapult industries into the future. We've seen it in solar and wind. We've seen it in nuclear over the years. And this is no different. I would say in the UK, if you look what is happening here versus what's happening in Europe and the US, I think we're missing a tremendous opportunity to create about 10,000 jobs. It was the investment forum earlier today, hosted by our Prime Minister Rishi Sunak. If you want to see more FDI come into this country, you need to show an opportunity to build it. And the beauty of this technology is it does not require something in the ground. It depends on feedstock, it depends on innovation, it depends on science, all the things that we are leading. So the role of government is threefold. One, and I'll start from the end, investors only flock to places where there is great certainty of legislation. Our governments, not just this government, tend to talk a lot about this and that, and I'm asking that in the time that is remaining for this parliament to create a very specific and clear framework for legislation, for mandates, for support. The second thing is, of equal importance is I believe that governments should support in a price support mechanism, which, by the way, they probably never have to put a penny into the ground, pay investors a penny, because there's so much demand for this fuel, as I indicated earlier, that it's basically a buyer of last resort or support of last resort. And the third thing is a very simple thing. The flight that we're flying tomorrow is made, the fuel is made, 88% of it from esters or fatty acids. We can get them from oil, the frying, or we can get it from tallow out of animal fat. And the UK has limited that at 15%, which is a great disadvantage versus the world. So I think that should remove. So certainty, price support mechanism, and increasing the applicability of the current generation of fuel as sustainable aviation fuel.
If it's such a good opportunity, why won't that happen anyway? Why won't, we've got pretty clear, legally mandated climate targets. Why won't this market, you're saying there aren't that many options, but there aren't that many routes to get there for the airline industry, so why won't this happen anyway?
Okay, I'm going to ask you a question. Why didn't it happen for solar? Because at the end of the day, when you were early in the adoption curve, there is a role for intervention by governments. That's a known way of getting science and investors to come in and back an idea. By the way, we'll play our part, right? We're going to pay a premium for these flights. We'll accept the mandate. We'll provide offtake into the manufacturer, so basically guaranteed price when it's manufactured. This requires radical collaboration. Not a single entity can solve it alone. The biggest entity, when we want big change to happen, happens to be the government and the will of the people.
And how optimistic are you, say, before this parliament runs out? That doesn't leave you very much time.
I don't usually apply optimist or an optimistic view. I'm very positive on the intent, and I think they can do more by reducing the time we debate these things and just moving into action. So I prefer action over words in this case.
And Labour, what do you think if it doesn't happen in this parliament, and if we get a Labour government? Of course, those are two assumptions, but would you be optimistic
I'll be very
they would pick this up as an issue too?
I'm convinced that any government, Labour or Conservative, that would look at the problem that we have in this country and in the world will take the right action. This is bipartisan. It has nothing to do with Labour or Conservatives. It may be different approaches to it. One will do more of demand side, one will do more supply side. The problem we are facing with the need to travel in a heating world crosses territory, country, and dare I say also politics.
Yeah, well, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
It's been very good to speak to you. Thank you very much. Now, you may just have to bear with us a second while we rearrange the stage, and then I will let my colleague, our UK Energy and Climate Editor, Russell Hargrave, come up, and he is going to introduce the next panel. But I think there's now a little bit of jiggery-pokery on the stage. Talk amongst yourselves. You can figure out questions. I should say that the Wi-Fi is on the screen. We will have a system. We're not going to do a roving mic, but we do have a system called Slido, which lets you ask questions. The details will appear up here, and you can enter questions. So think of a good question and try and put them into the screen, and then Russell will go through them and ask them to the panel. Make them as tricky as possible, because we enjoy the debate. So yeah, now's your chance.
As Kate mentioned, I'm Russell Hargrave. I'm the editor of Politico's Energy and Climate team here in London. And I'm very excited to be joined very quickly on this panel with experts who are going to talk through some of the issues that arose from that prior conversation, and I'm sure a lot of other things that their expertise will throw up as well. So just by way of introductions very quickly, moving along to my left, we're joined, thank you very much, by Anthony Brown, who is the Aviation Minister, by Chris Grayling, who is both the former Transport Secretary and also led the charge, I would say, to make sure sustainable aviation fuel was considered as part of the recent energy bill. We'll be sure to get into that. By Kim Carnahan, who runs the Sustainable Aviation Buyers Alliance, and we'll be talking with her a little bit about the US experience, I think, of how to get these sorts of sustainable ideas off the ground. And also to Maya Singer-Hobbs, Senior Research Fellow from the IPPR, and I learned the other day, a former PhD chemist. So if I start mixing up my green hydrogens with other types of hydrogens, I'm hoping that Maya will be on hand to help me out. Before we get started, I thought I was going to ask a question, just a 10-second answer from each of you, if I could. Kate used the G word in her question and answer. She's talked about greenwashing and the risks of that. So to each of you, we're talking about sustainable aviation fuels, technology that's going to kind of completely change things. Isn't there an easier answer here, which is, as Kate says, maybe we just fly that little bit less? That's a pretty straight line to decarbonising aviation. Quicker, easier to understand. Each of you, just 10 seconds. Isn't that the answer, Minister?
No, we're not in the business of telling people not to fly. And even if people fly a bit less, the planes would still use, if they're on normal aviation fuel, they'll still contribute huge amounts of carbon dioxide. And as Shay said, the easiest, simplest solution at the moment is we're on the brink of a technological revolution, is sustainable aviation fuel. And we know that it works. There's a lot of work to do, and that's more than 10 seconds.
Okay, no, that's fine. Chris, what do you think?
Well, people in democratic countries are simply not going to accept a platform that says, change your life totally, stop doing the things you enjoy doing. We have to change the way we do things, yes, but we have to use technology and innovation to do that. And those people who say it's all greenwashing are those people who want us to stop doing these things altogether. And I'm afraid in a democratic world, that's simply not possible.
Okay. Kim?
Well, I primarily represent aviation customers, and I promise you they are flying less, and that is the number one thing that they're doing to reduce emissions. But they're not flying zero, and they're not flying anywhere close to zero, so we still need SAF.
Okay. And finally, Maya.
I would say something similar. I think we're not going to reach net zero without demand reduction, and in fact, if you look at the government's Jet Zero strategy and the Climate Change Committee's projections for how we reach net zero in the aviation sector, that includes a pretty big chunk of demand reduction. And so I'm not saying that nobody can fly, but I think demand reduction is going to be part of that picture moving forward.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Anthony, if I could start with you. We heard directly from Shai 3 asks for government. You won't be surprised to know I'm going to run through each of them now and see what you can tell me about them. No. So, in a very short time frame before this Parliament ends, in 12 months or a little bit more than that, are you going to be able to set up a legislative framework that will reassure industry and his colleagues?
Yes, I hope. So we are introducing a mandate for sustainable aviation fuel, 10% target by 2030. So we'll be introducing that next year, starting in 2025. He talked about a revenue guarantee scheme, and in fact that's one thing that Chris Grayling was campaigning for. And again, we have now committed to that, and we will consult on the exact mechanism for that shortly, early next year, and then introduce that. So, and that will provide the framework both for the demand, making sure that goes up to 10%, but also to give sufficient guarantees and confidence to investors that they invest in this. The role of government. I mean, Kate asked, what's the role of government here? Our role is partly to pump prime. When you've got new technologies like this, we're technology neutral. We want to get to net zero aviation by 2050. That's our commitment, and for the airports to be net zero by 2040. We're technologically neutral. We're also investing in other forms of technologies of zero emission flying, but those other technologies are way off. They won't be here for many decades, and sustainable aviation fuel is the one that's here now that we know that it works. I think the figures I've seen show that in the UK about 2% of aviation fuel is currently sustainable. It's less than that globally. I was in Dubai last week at the UN as a an aviation organisation called ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organisation. We reached, I was representing a leading coalition of 62 countries who are ambitious on climate change for aviation, includes the EU and the US and Japan and so on. And we reached a global agreement to get to 5% sustainable aviation fuel by 2030. Now, a lot of people might say, well, that's just not enough. But the thing about when you have technology transitions, it's the very first steps that are by far the most important, because you get the regulatory framework in place, you show the technology works. You're going to see tomorrow that you can fly across the Atlantic in a commercial airline with 100% SAF. Rolls-Royce, previous week, they certified that all their engines, their entire commercial range of engines, can fly on 100% SAF. You get the production going, not just in the UK, but in all different countries around the world, because this is a global ambition. And one of the key themes of this UN summit last week was it's a thing for all the countries. I mean, every country is interested, some more than others. We're at the ambitious end of it, but everyone's interested in this. There's opportunity. There's a new industry being created. There's almost, any country can get involved with this, and they clearly really want to. I had bilateral meetings with aviation ministers in a lot of the global south and so on, and they don't have oil, but they can produce sustainable aviation fuel. So for them, it's a commercial opportunity. So I think it's a very, very exciting development. And the role of government, apart from pump priming, is creating the regulatory framework, and exactly as Shai asked for, that is what we're doing.
And if it is as exciting and technologically brilliant as you say, why has the government been sort of dragged to this place through the amendments, which I'll talk to Chris about in a moment? So it wasn't in the original energy bill. It wasn't something the department was trying to push through that legislation, but ultimately the government had to back down when Chris and his colleagues got involved. Why did you have to be pulled here?
I think, well, sorry, I've been in the job for 2 weeks, so I wasn't the one that Chris was lobbying at the time. So the one thing, we do know on wind energy that contracts for differences that create a revenue certainty for investors have been unbelievably successful at helping those new technologies, and that's why we're now 40% wind power in the UK, is largely because of contracts for differences. But you don't necessarily want those sort of contracts for every single new type of fuel. So I think that the government had to make a decision about where it applies and doesn't apply. But came fully on board. We had a ministerial statement in September. It's in the energy bill. We're committed to introducing a revenue certainty mechanism for sustainable aviation fuel now. And we'll consult on the precise mechanism of it, because there's lots of different ways we can do it. We don't want it to be ultimately funded by the taxpayer. We think this is a commercial industry. There's lots of big companies involved, lots of very profitable companies, and that ultimately it should be self-sustaining, and it shouldn't be that the average taxpayer is subsidising the aviation industry in that way. But actually, we totally accept the need for sustainable revenues for investors who are investing billions, because there's quite a few global energy companies or even smaller energy companies that are now planning billions of pounds worth of investment in the UK and other countries to set up plants for sustainable aviation, or to scale up plants for sustainable aviation. But what they do need is some certainty that the demand will be there and that the price will be there.
And are we going to get the 5 commercial scale
by 2025?
By 2025?
That's the government commitment.
It is? Okay, and that's...
And we've been funding, so we've got to fund the Future Aviation Fuel Fund, that Advanced Fuel Fund, where we've been funding, and we announced the results of it on November the 17th, a whole range of different projects to develop sustainable aviation fuel. And the interest, you didn't quite touched on this earlier in the debate in the discussion with Shai, but there's many different types of sustainable aviation fuel. They can come from a lot of different sources. So there's the cooking oil that Shai did mention, but also from waste, for example. There's projects where you make it from amoeba grown in vats. There's lots, and in America and Canada, they're doing it from wood residue from their logging industry. So there's lots of different sources of sustainable aviation fuel. We absolutely want to make sure that it is sustainable, and that means that there isn't environmental damage, and that's why in the UK we do have different standards from other countries, that we've actually said we don't want biofuels from sources that could end up harming the environment.
Okay, you won't be surprised to know on Slido quite a few of the questions related to precisely that question about sustaining that supply chain in a way that
it's really, really important. And we've got my officials here at the back over there. And the meetings I've had with them over the last couple of weeks, that's exactly one of the things
They don't look too nervous.
It's one of the things I've been pushing them on, because there's no point doing this if you end up causing massive deforestation and planting things with palm oil. And there would be no point in doing it. So it's really, really important that we have the assurance that that doesn't happen, and that you've got a really robust verification scheme to make sure that it is coming from the sources that you think it's coming from. These things are difficult. It's not. I used to be environment editor of the Times and the Observer newspaper, and I used to write stories about this sort of greenwashing. But you can have robust verification schemes, and that's what we are putting a lot of time and effort into making sure that it is that the sources where the aviation fuel come from, they say they come from, are actually the real sources, and they aren't degrading the environment.
Yeah, I think we will name some journalists who will be keeping an eye on exactly.
Well, I know they will. I know they will,
and already are. Just passing over to you, Chris, if that's all right. Your background is as Transport Secretary, but you're also leaving Parliament in a year's time. So this is one of the last great pushes I see, a big legislative victory to get sustainable aviation fuels taken seriously by the government. Why? Why was that something that you poured your capital into?
Well, I think the aviation sector is crucial for the future of this country. It is crucial for the development of economies in the developing world. Something I'm very passionate about. It's crucial to international conservation as well. If it weren't for long-haul aviation, protecting the protected areas of Africa would become a whole lot more difficult. We need, as a race, long-haul aviation in particular. We need to get to net zero in aviation. I think and it's pretty clear now, by the time we get to the mid-2030s, the equivalent of an A320 and A321 will probably be starting to fly with hydrogen. Great. But there is no technology anywhere in sight that is going to take a 777 to Australia or to Southern Africa with hydrogen. So there needs to be an alternative technology. SAF is both the intermediate step that enables the industry to reduce its emissions step by step over the next 10 years, but it's also the long-term solution for long haul until and unless we get to a position where there is a genuine technological alternative for long-haul aviation. So it matters for the UK, it matters for the world. We have, rightly in my view, set a higher bar in this country for the nature of the sustainable aviation fuel we are requiring airlines to put into their planes. We're not using plants in the way they are in the States. It's madness. We should not be, frankly, growing food crops to put in fuel tanks. That does happen. I don't approve of it. Equally, there are limits to how much we can use, for example, waste cooking oil. We import waste cooking oil into the Western world from Asia. There's limits to that, and actually, they may stop exporting it to us because they may want to use it themselves. So we actually have to find solutions that don't just tie us into what the US is doing. The European Union is focused particularly on the used cooking oil waste. We've rightly set a higher bar. But we need to be able to achieve that. And that means we need a domestic SAF industry here. And if we need a domestic SAF industry, we've got to incentivize and encourage it. There are investors out there who are willing to put money into building SAF plants in the UK. They need simply some certainty in the early stages. They're not going to put money in, build £1 billion plant, and it goes completely pear-shaped. And what I and a whole load of Conservative colleagues did in the summer, because this wasn't a one-man venture. Now I have 56 Conservatives who supported this. There would have been more if I'd gone on to collect more signatures. Just saying to the government, look, you're doing the right thing, but there's a missing piece of the jigsaw puzzle. Will you please fix it? And my hope now is as a result of what we did with the energy bill, by the time we get to the general election, there will be a very clear route map towards developing that industry. So whoever wins the election can put it into action straight away. And that was really the goal.
There's a mismatch, isn't there, between the scale of what needs to be done technologically, which, as you say, is pretty substantial, and the hope that the government is now going to take it seriously. But again, we've only got a year before next election, and not to labour the point, this was something that you and your, as you say, 56 colleagues and could be more, really had to sort of pile in to get done. So do we know, I guess my question is, how are you going to hold your colleagues' feet to the fire
there will
in
be
the
more
next year?
opportunities. But look, the reality is that if you're sitting in the Treasury or sitting in the business department, you've got a whole lot of different competing technologies looking for support. That's just a reality. There are actually far more things the government could support than it's able to support. So actually it's about saying, look, actually, this is really quite important. This needs to be our priority. And that's what we were doing. And I'm confident now that a process has started that will get us to that point of having the route map available, will enable us to put in place the necessary legislation, enable the investors to move forward with confidence. And there will be moments over the next 12 months for a gentle tap on the shoulder, should we say, of ministers and officials. But I do feel that progress is being made. I'm actually very glad that this man is doing the job because I know him and trust him. But it's also about getting the Treasury engaged. It's about getting the whole of government engaged because it's not just a transport issue. It's an industry issue for the UK. We have decided to set a higher bar. We won't necessarily be able to invest the fuels that we need. It would be a pretty crazy situation to get to a situation where essentially airlines are having to pay penalty charges because they can't buy the fuel that we are legislating to require them to put in their planes. And so actually the cost of travel goes up and we're not even saving the planet. And that's a position we must not get to.
My colleague Charlie Cooper likes to talk about nascent technologies, and SAF feels like one of the more nascent of all the technologies that we write about on our energy team. Of course, solar, we talk about offshore wind and all these things, everything's developing. This feels like it's much more in the foothills than elsewhere. You were Transport Secretary. What was it? Was there any kind of discussion like this, that 2016-2019 period? Was it ever on the radar?
It really has only come forward in the last couple of years, I'd have said. I mean, I think, there's been a very loose, nebulous concept around. But I would say that it's really only in the last couple of years that SAF has become a realistic prospect, that technology has moved on far enough for it to be able to do the kind of things that we're seeing happen this week.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed. Kim, I hope I'm describing your work right when you say that part of it is sort of looking after kind of big companies. We know the names of the brands if you wanted to name them, but essentially big global companies that are trying to bring their own work further towards net zero, look after their own aviation habits and all the rest of it. Is there a lot of help for that in the US that's well targeted, and is that something the UK should be copying?
Well, so what the Sustainable Aviation Buyers Alliance does is it gets big corporations together, Microsoft, Deloitte. We've got a lot of banks, consulting companies, tech companies, now a lot of companies that are actually shipping goods, Novo Nordisk, pharma companies. So they're shipping stuff, they're shipping people, right, around the world, and they want to decarbonize their flying. And so what we help them do is partner with airlines and pay the premium associated with sustainable aviation fuel. So rather than the airlines having to always pay 100% of that premium, it's a lot, we come in there and we fill the gap for them. And to get to your question, filling the gap is a lot easier in some places than in others. So right now, all the SAF that we're helping our customers support, almost all of it, is being made in the United States. And the reason it's being made in the United States is the US has a number of different incentives, especially in certain US states, that we can stack on top, or the fuel providers can stack on top of each other. And then the premium that's left, again, still a lot. It comes to around, just on average, $400 US dollars per ton of CO2 reduced, which is how companies think about cost, is how much does it cost me to reduce 1 ton of my emissions? $400 a ton, compared to, in Europe at least, on average, about $800 a ton. So if you've got companies like ours, they're gonna be supporting SAF. We run competitive procurement processes to see where can we support the most SAF with the least amount of money. It's almost all in California these days. So Shai mentioned it. I think I've heard both of you mention it as well. It's an industry issue, right? If you want to get more customers like the ones I represent to spend money on SAF, then find some way to help shrink that premium so we can spend our money in the UK, just like right now we're doing in California.
Okay. And one of the other things that's feeding into all that, of course, is something like the Inflation Reduction Act, that kind of great big green subsidy bonanza, as we like to call it in our newsletter every morning. Do subscribe if you get the chance. How much of a kind of an advantage does that give firms on the other side of the transatlantic to tap into? Is the UK kind of behind that?
Everyone in the world is behind it. Because even in the EU, where there's a mandate, and Saba has no preference. We have no official position on whether SAF uptake should be mandated or it should be supported through tax credits. But the impact is, if it's a tax credit, we have a reduced premium we can pay to get more SAF into airplanes. If it's a mandate, actually we have nothing to do, which is great. Feel free to do it all for us, I'm sure most of my customers would say, but we know it's probably not going to be enough. So if the mandate is 5% SAF, you're going to stop at 5% SAF in Europe on average, right? You're not going to see much more investment until there's, until like others have mentioned, you hit above 5%, above 10%, then we start to see economies of scale and costs just start rolling down and you see more and more uptake. But I think the mandate option is a perfectly fine one, but you're not going to see a lot of customers, like the ones I represent, flooding into those areas because, again, if they buy emission reductions from SAF in Europe, anything above that 5% is still going to cost them $800 a ton, which is a lot. In case you don't know, I think offsets are like $30 a ton these days or something like that, so $800 is a lot more expensive.
And where does it fit into the EU plan, which also has its own subsidy system for this stuff? Another competitive market for the UK to try and kind of get to grips with. How are we doing?
A bit, but I think the way the EU is approaching it, the UK has the opportunity to actually steal a lot of that industry this way as well.
Mm-hmm. So we should look out for sort of firms potentially hopping back across the channel?
Or we'll just buy it all, frankly.
That's probably a quicker solution. Thank you. Maya, we are a year out from a general election. I can read the polls, you can read the polls, everyone can read the polls. IPPR left-leaning think tank. Do you have a sense on the Labour side that they get the size of the challenge involved, which I think all of our speakers have touched on?
I think the Labour commitment to 28 billion ramping up over the course of a parliament suggests that there is an understanding of the scale of investment needed. That's not just aviation, but across sort of the economy. At IPPR, we would advocate very strongly for a green industrial strategy, which sort of touches on pretty much what everyone has been saying about the need for government to support industries to sort of move in the direction that we want. So I think, I do not know the specifics, they're holding their cards quite close to their chest, but certainly the 28 billion suggests that there is an understanding of the scale of the problem and the scale of the investment needed.
And how do you make the argument for this funding if the person behind you in the queue, in this future government, whatever stripe it might be, is saying we need that money for the health service, or we need that money for kids' school books? Like, it is a totemic offer from the Labour Party at the moment, but also, like, it may evaporate in contact with the real world, mightn't it?
I mean, it's a great question. It goes beyond aviation, I would say.
It does.
But I think we know that the impact of climate change have health impacts. We know that, if you haven't got investment in schools, the buildings crumble down around you, and we're going to see extreme temperature, extreme weather effects. All of those are going to have an impact on children's schooling, if we're going to talk about schooling, or people's health. And we saw last year with the 40-degree heat that people were dying due to the heat. So I think I would argue that investment in green technologies and a green industrial strategy is a preventative measure as much as it is about sort of imagining the future that we want to live in and keeping emissions down.
And I'll take you back onto sustainable aviation fuel again. What do you think are the biggest sort of policy blocks? What would IPPR be saying to any future government about what are the things that really need to be dealt with first here?
On SAF?
On SAF, yeah, to get it over the line.
So I guess IPPR would take a sort of tech-neutral stance to aviation. I think that, in my mind, SAF is, rather than a milestone, it's a bit of a stepping stone. It's still not zero-emission flying, and I think that we would be cautious about putting all of our eggs in the SAF basket, as it were. I think one of the biggest issues, and you mentioned this actually, is the source of the feedstocks. If we collected all of the cooking oil in the country, that would amount for about 1% of the SAF that we need. You're right, we don't want to be growing crops to produce SAF. I think there's a big question about if we're going to do this, where on earth are we going to source it from in a way that is not sort of shipping it in from other countries who are going to want to be using that to decarbonize their own fleets. So I think there's a big question there about our feedstocks. And then I think there's a question about whether this is the horse that you want to back, and whether I think there needs to be I think we need to be careful not to back SAF at the expense of other technologies that might actually represent zero emission flying. SAF still produces tailpipe emissions, and we don't want to stop there.
And can you give me an example of the technologies that might turn out to be even better than SAF?
There's a few that people are sort of floating. People are talking about hydrogen. People are talking about fuel cell technologies. I think there's lots of work going on in this space. I wouldn't want to back any of them at the moment.
Okay.
But I think it is the role of government to support that innovation.
Yeah. And talking of innovation, there will be things that might be considered alongside SAFs and these sorts of developments. I'm particularly interested in sort of carbon capture and those sorts of technologies. Minister, I wondered if that's also part of the discussions inside your department.
So we are looking at the entire range of different technological solutions. So in fact, on the different aviation technologies, we've got this Aviation Technology Institute. We're giving it over £900 million to basically help seed fund a whole range of different technologies. We're not choosing one. And it's interesting how some technologies start behind us like a horse race, and then they sort of come ahead. We're talking earlier about battery technologies in cars have actually advanced very, very rapidly. And actually now you can use batteries in trucks, in quite heavy trucks, and that wasn't expected 5 years ago. So we don't know what the future holds. So we invest in everything. But there are other things. So things like the design of airspace, for example, you can make that a lot more efficient, and that will reduce energy use. Also the design of the actual aeroplane. So just outside my constituency, I've got the Whittle Lab, which Frank Whittle, who invented the jet engine, it's a pure aeronautics laboratory, and they're looking at a lot of different ways of really adjusting the shape of the plane and the shape of the wing and the engine and so on to dramatically reduce or improve efficiency. And then you mentioned carbon capture and storage. That's definitely, I've long been a supporter of that in principle. It needs to scale up. They do it in Norway. The Sleipner reserve 1 million tonnes a year, but actually we need to make sure that works well as well. And we need to look at everything. In terms of climate change in general, there is no single silver bullet. We're talking about aviation today, but actually we've also got to sort out home heating and sort out vehicles and other forms of transport, land use, and government is just looking at everything and not, backing one horse. But we are making a lot of progress.
There was a slight danger if you're looking at everything that it's difficult to focus. How are you going to prioritise?
Well, clearly you have a system. So we just awarded grants for that I mentioned. When you asked me earlier, we awarded grants for different projects to produce sustainable aviation fuel. But we have a scoring system there. We're not we're making sure we're giving money to credible projects, and it is the role of government to pump prime. It might be that this would happen already anyway, but actually we can make it happen more quickly and get people to look at things they wouldn't otherwise be looking at. So one thing we haven't talked about is power to liquid. So this is where you basically get green electricity, and you basically produce the sustainable aviation out of the chemicals that are in the air. Hydrogen, carbon, nitrogen, which is an oxygen, which is basically what hydrocarbon fuels are made out of, are all in the air in this room. And there's people looking at how you can develop that, and that's basically what plants have done over the billions of years. They've taken the gases out of the atmosphere and turned it into fuels, which are then put in airplanes. But there are obviously other ways of doing that. So we are looking at every sort of potentially viable technology.
And to sit alongside the technology, we've talked about the funding mechanisms. This is a question possibly for Chris and Anthony in particular. Contracts for difference has been floated as one thing that is sort of maybe modelled around. But of course, CFD turned out to be pretty complicated and controversial in its most recent round because it didn't nab any offshore wind development, and one of the key things it's there to achieve, really. So is there kind of learning from that model that then can get applied to the future mechanism?
Government should always learn from what's happened in the past, absolutely. And the main learning from contract for difference is the last round, as you say, didn't succeed, but actually the previous rounds have been very, very successful. And contracts for difference, as I said earlier, is seen, I think, pretty much universally as one of the key reasons why the wind power in the UK has taken off so much, and far more. When I was writing about environment issues for the Times and the Observer 20 years ago, no one thought wind power would reach the level that it's reached, and contract for differences have been part of that. But there are lots of different ways you can structure revenue certainty for the companies that want to introduce SAF, and that's why next year we'll be consulting on it, on the different options that there are, and no doubt people will feed in, and maybe Virgin will feed in But certainly people will feed in about what they think the right solution is, and we'll look at that. And as you say, it can get quite complicated. We definitely need to learn lessons. I mean, both for the contract for differences for wind power here, but actually there are also similar schemes in other countries and other industries, and work out exactly what's the best way to make sure we get the investment, because ultimately that's what it's about, to get the innovation.
I was struck, Maya, by one of the things, Kim, by one of the things you said about the sort of the large firms who are really sort of getting into this, talking with your company. I mean, how helpful and important is that to have these kind of big corporate voices leading this discussion? I mean, we've heard from Virgin Atlantic already today. There are plenty of other sort of companies in the mix for that. But does that help drive more interest?
Doesn't hurt. that's my goal, or my what I think about. Basically, we do have some of our companies that are getting into lobbying around SAF and support for SAF as well. But for the most part, it's just them putting their money where their mouth is. So at least for now, it's a bit of a bridge. And it's still small, but in our latest round, I think we raised about $250 million US dollars, about 200 pounds for our latest SAF purchase. Not big enough, but not nothing, as I'd say. I'm from Texas, sorry, it's a bad phrase. That was just basically a pilot. So our first attempt to aggregate demand on behalf of about 20 companies, and we raised a good chunk of change. So hopefully we'll be able to scale that up, maybe 100 times that in the next couple of years. It still does not fill the gap. The government has to step in. We need that support. Not just in the UK or the US or the rest of Europe, but literally all over the world. We need more governments to step up. But in the meantime, our companies are at least doing what they can. Like I said, it's not cheap to support these fuels, and they're actually putting their money where their mouth is, because they've made big commitments to reduce emissions, and they're following through on it in a way that is not at all something that their shareholders would necessarily even all understand. So there are a lot of times the CEOs are having to go to the shareholders and explain why they're spending on decarbonization.
It's a fascinating clash, I've always thought, between kind of what shareholders first assume a business needs to do, but then secondarily you often get people who are very kind of engaged with this stuff who do get it, but it's not as instinctive maybe as what you start. I started off by asking everyone to answer a question inside 10 seconds. I'm going to be a bit more generous with this one. But maybe if I could ask each of you, we'll go in reverse just for the last 4 minutes here, 1 minute each, to give a sense of what does this look like in 6 months' time? What are the kind of the steps forward that maybe the government has taken that would be sort of a cause for celebration? It's a stranger question for the ministers to answer, I guess, but we can start.
Might be easier for him to answer, yeah.
What would IPPR be kind of knocking on the door hoping we'd get?
I think we'd hope for more security and more security for businesses, so they know the landscape that they're operating in. And what we'd like to see is, support for them to take the actions that we want to see. So whether that is investment in SAF, or whether that is large-scale investment in zero aviation flights in whatever form that looks like, we'd like to see more certainty for businesses so that it gives them certainty to invest.
Definitely, Maya.
Definitely would agree with that. I think something I'd add, and I've heard a few others mention it as well, is making sure that we're paying attention to the sustainability aspect. I mean, SABA is a joint initiative of 2 environmental NGOs, so we pay a lot of attention to the certification of the fuel and the sustainability standards. So making sure that, we're not having to be the one at the end of the line requiring it, but rather having that start earlier up and having it just basically be assumed. Your fuel must be certified according to a certain sustainability standard, a high sustainability standard. And we'd like to not have to always be the bad guy kind of saying no to these uncertified fuels, which we do these days.
Okay, and just to follow up on that, so that kind of almost kite marking process, is that kind of easily understood by the firms that you work with? Or
no.
No, but it does feel essential.
That's why they join our organization, is because they want to learn. And so we play that role in educating them on what they need to be looking for when they're offered a contract. If they're not buying through us, they need to know what to look for in terms of fuel certification, in terms of feedstock choices and that kind of thing, LCA, percentage reduced compared to fossil jet. So we have, we've published basically a standard which says we think this is all the ways in which you should be checking the fuel when you get a proposal. And if they don't want to do it themselves, we do it for them, because we're very committed to making sure that fuel is truly sustainable. Okay.
Chris, 6 months from now, what hasn't happened that gets you checking for Anthony's number on your phone and giving him a call?
Well, let me just, the one that we haven't mentioned tonight is the context of this. So long-haul aviation is a very small proportion of aviation as a whole. So actually, I think there's pretty much consensus that to get to net zero by 2050, it will take hydrogen as short haul to be the prime means of propulsion. So we're talking about a small part of the aviation sector, but without SAF, we can't do long haul. So that's what makes it particularly important. It also, and I noticed one of the questions coming in was about the feedstock. Long haul aviation can be supported for the future by recycling our waste. The most obvious feedstock source for the UK to use is the black bin bag waste that we generate all the time, the plastic waste, of which we have far, far, far too much. And so there is a real environmental virtuous circle there. Of course, SAF doesn't generate total zero emissions. It doesn't get close to that. It's better than we've got at the moment. It doesn't get close to that. But it can deliver some extra environmental benefits alongside that. And the feedstocks that will, I think, be a key part of what we do in this country, actually taking huge chunks of waste out and recycling it for a positive purpose rather than dumping it in landfill or exporting containers of plastic seems to be like a pretty virtuous place for the UK to be. So I hope in 6 months' time we will have taken a substantial step towards creating the route map that I described earlier that will enable investors who can turn plastic waste and black bin bag waste into aviation fuel into actually saying, right, we will now acquire our sites, we'll raise the funds, we'll invest in the plants in the UK. If we don't do that, we ourselves will not have a domestic industry, we will not necessarily be able to import what we're mandating for the industry, and it's going to cause real problems. So I think there's a real imperative for the government over the next 6 months to move forward, to do the consultations it legally has to do, to take the steps it legally has to take, and to have a blueprint that is available to be implemented quickly after that. Ideally, start before the election, but at the very least, start immediately after the election. And alongside that, if we deliver all of that, there's some great potential new investments in parts of the country that need investments.
Very quickly, anything that gets started like Chris has described before the election? That's quite a challenge.
Well, we will consult on the revenue guarantee scheme in the next 6 months. We will be a step closer to the mandate of 10% by 2030. I think one of the big changes that will happen over the next 6 months, because this is a very rapidly changing technology, and there are people working on it across the planet, governments across the planet, across industry, big corporations, well-financed, lots of startups with very smart ideas, that will have a far better idea in 6 months of which technologies are more likely to be successful than we have at the moment. But I think you'll also get a lot more investment in the UK coming in. There's lots of people, we know lots of people interested in investing here, that they'll actually be a lot closer to having a good SAF industry in the UK producing this fuel for airlines.
But that's not a commitment to definitely doing it for the general election.
No, I said we'll consult on the revenue guarantee scheme. We're moving ahead with the 10% mandate, which provides the guarantee there. We've started funding all these projects within the industry already. We've made those awards, so that's all. It's all moving full steam ahead. Okay. That's old technology, full steam ahead. I just thought. We've got off to a flying start. How about that?
No. We'll end with the railways. That's fine. Thank you very much indeed to Anthony and Chris and to Kim and to Maya. Thank you very much to all of you. Yes, wonderful. Thank you to everyone who's been watching at home, and thank you so much for everyone here who has joined us. I think there's something about cocktails, so I imagine this room will empty very quickly and that one will fill up very soon. But thank you very much indeed. Thank you, everyone.